Hi, this is Gilles, the radio prepper. Today's video will be different from what I've done before. It's more of a theoretical video, but it's a very important one because I'm going to be talking to you about frequencies and ranges. You guys let me know if it's the kind of video that you're just interested in or not. But whether you want to communicate with someone who might be, say, 20 miles away or a couple hundred miles away or on another continent, you will have to use different frequencies, different bands, simply because some of them will work at some ranges and not at others. Some of them might work better in the summer or in the winter, at night or during the day. There are many factors that affect propagation and many different propagation modes. And all those frequencies behave differently. So it's very important to know that because, of course, it helps you make contact and, well, it might also help you decide which kind of radio you need to buy and train with. So let's have a look. So let's define our ranges. Our local is up to 20 miles or about 30 kilometers. This is probably the easiest range to cover. Near regional is 20 to about 100 miles, 150 kilometers. And that's pretty difficult. It's one of the most difficult range to cover, actually. Far regional would be from 100 to 400 miles up to 600 kilometers. And then we have a global range, which of course covers the whole Earth's surface. And different ranges require different frequencies and antennas. Again, regional is the most difficult. I'm not going to go into great detail about the theory, but here we have frequencies and bands and the formula to convert from megahertz to the wavelength in meters. Of course, a picture is worth 1,000 words, so wavelength is the distance between two crests that you can see here. And an antenna, to be efficient, has to be a half wavelength. The frequency ranges we are going to be working with are HF, high frequency, 2 to 30 MHz, VHF, very high frequency, 30 to 300 MHz, and UHF, ultra high frequency, 300 to 3 GHz, which is very extremely high. Mostly we'll be using, we'll be using all of them, but for long distance communications, we'll use HF. For local and I would say near regional, we'll use VHF, and UHF is for local communications. The easiest way to calculate the optimum length of your antenna is to use this formula. If you use feet, simply divide, take 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz, or if you use meters, use 145 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So for instance, for the 80 meter band, we have 468 divided by 3.5 megahertz. That gives you 133.7 feet, and it's pretty close to the correct length actually. We also need to define near vertical incidence skywave, NVIS, which works from about 3 to 10 megahertz. And this is where you send your signal straight up. It refracts at a very high angle into the ionosphere and rains back down into a broad range around you. So that would cover hopefully anything from local to far regional range. Okay, and we start with our first band at last, 80 meters. We'll start with the lower bands first and we'll go up in frequency. Of course, the lowest bands will have the longest wavelength. So 80 meter is a pretty long wavelength. It's the bottom of HF. 3.5 to 4 megahertz in most places. Of course, here in France, in Europe, we have 3.5 to 3.8 megahertz. But the pros of this band is that 80 meter is like a regional telephone. It works most of the time, and mostly it's used for NVIS, which we just defined. So if you take a long antenna, of course 80 meters, we'll need an antenna that's 40 meters long, a half wave. Of course there are other antennas like quarter waves and different lengths, but the most efficient usually is the half wave antenna. But on 80 meter, the antenna being so long, we're going to string it horizontally. That has another advantage, is that since the signal goes perpendicular to the wire, the signal will go straight up and it will refract at a high angle on the ionosphere, in the ionosphere, and come back down into a wide radius. So it's a great band for, it will cover regional, near regional and far regional and local as well. So as you can see, it's very useful for prepping because you can cover a lot of distance. If you can put your antenna vertically, that would be quite difficult. You could also cover very long distances. You could get into the global range, but it's not really what 80 meter is used for, because of course there are better bands to do that. Usually it's a band that you can use as well, during the day and at night. It works better at night, and it works better in the winter as well. But again, it's very useful for nets, a lot of nets, and a net is a grouping of people who at a certain time, a certain day, get together on the air, and there is a roundabout turn with everybody. Everybody introduces themselves, and we just know who is on the air, and it's a net. And most nets, regional nets, take place on 80 meters. So a lot of chit-chat, rag chewing, we call it, takes place on 80 meters. So it's a great band for prepping. It's just that antennas are very long and not very practical for portable operations. Although I have done so and used them, and it's not as hard as one might think. So I wouldn't hesitate to include 80 meter into my kit, and have an antenna, a portable antenna even for 80 meters. And now we go up to 40 meters. 40 meters, I skipped 60 meters, by the way, because 60 meters is an excellent band too, which has properties from both 80 and 40 meters. But not many people can use 60 meters, so we're not going to talk about it here. 40 meters, on the other hand, is a very good band for prepping. It's one of the best. I would say it's probably the single best band for prepping. It's from 7 to 7.3 megahertz. In France here it's 7 to 7.2. And its advantages is that it does work for NVIS, but it does also work for long distance. So it's a band that basically can do it all. It can cover all ranges, local, near regional, regional, and global. Of course, the disadvantage is that it still requires a pretty long antenna, 20 meters long, about, I think it's 64, 66 feet or something like that. So it's not the easiest band to work with because of the antenna length again, but boy, is it a good band. I mean, you can use it for everything. If I had to have only one band, a single band radio and nothing else, I would choose 40 meters because it does it all. So make sure that you do have a 40 meter antenna and a 40 meter radio. And they are excellent single band 40 meter radios out there. Then we move up to 30 meters, 10.1 to 10.15 megahertz. And the first advantage here is that there are no contests on 30 meters, and I think that's absolutely awesome because sometimes when you have to practice and it's a contest weekend, oh boy, you're not going to be able to work at all, make any contact, because the whole band is taken up. And unfortunately, a lot of people who do contests, I think it's a little bit like driving a car. Some people are very nice people, very respectful, and as soon as they get into a car, that's another story. And I think that's what happens with contests. People are really into the game, and they want to get points, and they just trample everything, the whole band, and they don't let anyone else do any make any contacts, and that's too bad. But anyway, I'm not going to ramble about that. I could talk about that for an hour. No disrespect to contesters, by the way, but it's just that I guess there are a lot of bad apples who spoil it for everybody, and that's too bad. Anyway, 30 meter is usually not allowed for voice modes. It depends on the country, but most countries do not allow voice modes, I believe, on 30 meters, so it's mostly Morse code, CW, or digital modes. And that's very good, because of course if you do Morse code, you have a very simple small Morse code radio. You can go on 30 meter and you're not going to have interferences from voice users, because of course the Morse code and most digital modes have a very narrow bandwidth, so you can put a whole lot more people into a band using a digital and CW mode. I really like 30 meters. For people who do CW Morse code, I think it's really a must-have band. If you only do voice, well, it doesn't really matter that much, even if you're doing digital operations. It's a great band, but you can do with 20 and 40. But for anybody who's doing Morse code, just get 30 meters, because it's an excellent band. Not so good for, not actually really working well for NVIS and regional and local ranges. Although, of course, any band will do local, but it's not very good for regional ranges. But it's excellent for long distance. When 20 meters, 14 megahertz, isn't quite open, meaning that the propagation isn't there and long distance contacts are not really possible, usually 30 meters will work. So if I had to choose between 20 and 30 meters for CW using Morse code, I would choose 30 meters. If I was using voice, though, between the two, of course, I would have to choose 20 meters. But great choice for Morse code operators. Now, 20 meters, one of the probably the most used band in all the amateur radio bands, 14 to 14.35 megahertz. This is an excellent band for prepping, for voice operations, and Morse code or digital. But it has a great advantage, is that, first of all, antennas are not that long. 20 meters means 10 meter antenna. And a 10 meter antenna is around 34 feet or something like that, which you can get fiberglass poles that are that size and not too bulky to carry around. It's great for DX, so long distance communications. And you also have a frequency on 20 meters, 14300 kilohertz, 14.3 megahertz, which is a sort of an agreed upon emergency frequency, also used for maritime boats. This frequency has safety nets and a lot of activity related to safety and emergencies. If you're at sea on a sailboat somewhere and something goes wrong, you don't have a maritime radio, you have an amateur radio, you're going to call on 14.3 megahertz. And it's a great frequency to monitor, by the way, if you're into prepping or sailing or anything like that, because you could hear some real emergency contacts, calls being made, and it's pretty interesting, and you might be able to help someone as well, who knows. So it is probably the most popular band with 40 meter. 20 and 40 are the two mostly the most used bands. It's a daytime band mostly. Other bands like 30 meters can be used in the evening, 40 meters also in the evening, 80 meters evening and night, but 20 meters is a daytime band. So at night, it could work. Sometimes you have really surprises, and it's always daytime somewhere. But it's a band that will work best during the day. It's a very active band. There's a lot of people there, so you will always, probably find someone to talk to. Now we go up to 15 meters. And 15 meters is an awesome band, but it's not, well, it is used, but for prepping, I'm not sure it's a great choice. It does have advantages though. And of course, that's would be long skip distances, so good long distance communications, very good long distance capabilities. The antennas are, I would say, short for HF. 15 meters, that means a 7.5 meter antenna, so it's pretty short. It's a wide band, 21 to 21.45 megahertz, so you have a lot of bandwidth there. So it's a great band for global range, but it's not always open, meaning that the propagation often doesn't allow 15 meters to go anywhere but local. So you can't rely on it. It's a good band to have, but you can't rely on it for to be sure to be able to find someone at any day. So a good band to have, but it's unreliable during the solar cycle low, which we are right in the middle of it right now. So it's not good for regional. CB, I think a lot of you guys are going to be interested in this one, because of course CB doesn't require a license. So usually CB, well, it's the 11-meter band, and it's from 26.965 to 27.405 megahertz. Of course, a lot of people have their radios modified, and I'm not, against modifying your radio. I'm just against people modifying their radios and using them on the extra frequencies, because that can cause a lot of interference, especially if people use amplifiers. And I'm totally against amplifiers. First of all, of course, because they're not necessary. You don't need an amplifier. It's an urban legend that you need an amp to contact anyone. Of course, on the CB band, sometimes it does help, because you have so many people on that band at times that if you don't have an amp, nobody's going to hear you because someone else does have one. And that's a big problem. It's a bit of an arms race. But amps, especially CB amps, are not good. To get a good amplifier, you usually have to spend about $700-800. So nobody is going to spend that much for a CB. They're going to buy an Italian amp at a couple of $100. But of course, that's going to splatter all over the other frequencies, multiples of their frequency, and it's going to create a lot of problems for a lot of people. So don't do that, guys. But CB is still a good band for prepping. First of all, because of course everybody has one and their cousin have one, and CBs are everywhere. I started with CB in the 80s. I was 14 years old, and I remember at the time it was the social media that we had. There was nothing else. There was no internet, of course, and no cell phones, and lots of people had a CB in their car because it allowed them to communicate with their family or friends. And I remember in my neighborhood there was a grandmother who had a CB in her kitchen. Lots of people had CBs at home too, and it was friendly and self-policing, and there was no trouble, and lots of kids used CB as well. Unfortunately, later some people started using bad language and had really bad behaviors on CB, and it went down the drain. Helped, of course, by the appearance of cell phones. But it used to be great. It's a little bit better now, I believe. It has cleaned up a little bit, so there are still a lot of CBs floating around from the 80s that still work. People have them in their, somewhere in a closet or in a box, and it's just waiting. But a lot of them still work. So if there was a big emergency, global or continent-wide emergency, a lot of CBs could come out of the closets. So it would be a good thing to monitor is the CB band. Now the pros, of course, is when the band is open, which is not very often, because CB is a pretty high frequency. It's the top of HF, and It's not, it doesn't skip very often. The propagation isn't always good for CB. So it's a very good long distance band, but not all the time. Actually, not that often. One big advantage is that the antennas are very short, and that's very good, especially on vehicles. And of course, you need no license. But it's not good for regional communications. You know, you try to make a 200-mile or 100-mile contact with the CB, good luck. So it's very unreliable, very unreliable. It's good for local though. That's very useful, and it also only has 40 channels. I like to have a CB, especially in a car. If you do get a CB, get one with SSB, single sideband. AM and FM are not enough. AM, FM will cover, usually a local range, but you're going to have difficulties making contacts much further. Sometimes it will work, but rarely. But SSB, on the other hand, is very good for long distance, weak signals. It's more efficient. It's less bandwidth, so it goes a little further. CB is a daytime use band, but sometimes you can be surprised also. I once made a contact from the north of France to Massachusetts in the US. I think it was around 1 a.m. with a CB radio. And that was before I moved to the US, and I'm back now, but it was a very long time. I was barely out of my teenage days then, and I made that contact. I was ecstatic. It was so rare, but it did work, and in the middle of the night, so who knows. Of course, CB right now doesn't work too well because we are again at the bottom of the solar cycle, so we'll have to wait a few years for CB to work again. But you want to include radios in your preps, which of course you should do. Also get a CB, or get a radio that you can unlock to get the CB bands, and not all of them do that, but it's a very good thing to have. Now, of course, you can't transmit on a CB band with a modified ham radio. So if you want to use CB and practice with CB, just get a CB. They're pretty cheap. Up a little bit to the 10-meter band. It's kind of like CB, but it's an amateur band. It's from 28 to 29.7 megahertz. It's a very wide band. You have a lot of bandwidth, 1.7 megahertz, which is absolutely crazy. It's probably the largest, well, not the largest amateur band, but the largest amateur band that's used on a regular basis, basically. And it's very popular because it's very good for DX, long distance, just like CB. But again, it's unreliable. You can count on it. Sometimes it'll work and most of the time it won't. So it's good for local also, and there are actually repeaters for the 10-meter band in FM. But most people will of course use SSB and Morse code, CW mode, and digital modes. So a lot of bandwidth. Antennas are very, very short, 5 meters. So that's really short and you can have very efficient antennas that are easy to carry around. But again, it's not good for regional. Now we are leaving HF to move into the VHF range. And VHF it's above 30 megahertz, but there are no amateur bands between 30 and 50 megahertz. So the 6-meter band starts at 50 megahertz, goes up to 54. Of course, in Europe, we have less, 50 to 52. So it's not as good, but okay. The 6-meter band will be used mostly for local range. And its advantages are that it's decent in the woods. It deals with vegetation better than some other bands, better than certainly UHF. So a lot of military radios have the 6-meter band in them. I have two PRC 351 which cover I think 30 to 74 megahertz. So the 6-meter band is smack in the middle of that. And I use those radios on the 6-meter band because of course we don't have 4 meters. here in France. But people in England or Belgium, for instance, can use the 4-meter band, around 70 megahertz, but we won't talk about the 4-meter band. But 6-meter is called the magic band. Why? Well, because it does some weird things sometimes, and magical things. It's good for local. The antennas are short, pretty short. It's not used much, so if you want a little bit of privacy, I'm not talking about anything like encryption or anything like that, but since not many people listen to 6 meters, if you don't want to be bothered, you might want to use it. I once had a gunset communicator, which is an AM transceiver, a tube transceiver, tube technology from the 50s, from the Cold War. And I love those radios. I'm a big fan of the Gunset Communicator 3 on 6 meters. I don't have one right now anymore. I used to have 2 of them. But they're great radios. But I called for weeks and I didn't get any single answer. Every day I called for weeks and nothing. And I knew I knew the radio worked. It worked fine, and I had a big antenna, so I know I was getting out. But there's just nobody listening. I tried here in France to call on 6-meter FM. I tried quite a few times, and I didn't get a single answer. So it's not used much. I wish it was a little bit more anyway. Although sometimes, when it does its magic, the 6-meter band opens, propagation, just all of a sudden it starts working, and then everyone jumps on it, and it's a big cacophony, and you can't, contacts are very short, and people want to make as many contacts as they can, and it's crazy. I don't even try to call when 6-meter opens. But sometimes when you catch it at the beginning of the opening, nobody's there yet, and you can make long distance contacts. It's a lot of fun, but it's not something you can rely on. Again, it's not for global range. Sometimes it will work for regional, but it's unreliable. And it's good for local though. It's pretty good for local. If you're part of a group and you want inter-group communications, you can use you can buy military radios like the RF-10 from the Eastern Bloc countries, and or the PRC 351 from England. Those are great radios. They don't cost that much. They're extremely rugged. They're heavy, but if it's just a group thing and you're not carrying anything else, you can use them. And well, that's it for 6 meters. Let's go up again. 2 meters, 144 to 148 megahertz. Of course, we have less here. Again, I'm starting to get the impression that we're not very well served in Europe as far as frequencies. You guys in the US have a whole lot more than we do. 2-meter band, 144 to 148, 144 to 146 in Europe. Now that's a special band. 2 meters is a special band because it's probably the most popular band for VHF, and that's for sure it is. It's excellent for local communications. It's it uses very short antennas, and so you can use handhelds on the 2-meter band, walkie-talkies. It can also go pretty far using SSB, and people forget about that. And I've just become a very a proponent of using 2-meter on SSB, USB or LSB. Usually it's USB, upper sideband on 2 meters, because it's excellent for weak signals. And I've made contacts. Check my video that I did on the Cap Blanc-Nez, the coast, the French coast here, the cliffs, where I set up a Yagi antenna and talked to England. And I talked to people all over England, hundreds of miles, couple hundred miles, no problem on the 2-meter band. It's amazing. I mean, it doesn't work all the time, of course. You only have to wait for openings, and so sometimes it will only do local. But it's very good though for near regional. And remember what I say, near regional, for up to maybe 100 miles. If you have group members or family that lives within 100 miles, using the 2-meter band with SSB, single sideband, will allow you to make contact fairly often. Not all the time, but fairly often. You combine that with the 80-meter band, and you pretty much, are sure to make contact, almost all the time. It's not for global range. Some people are able to make contacts pretty far with 2-meter, maybe up to 1,000 miles. And that's absolutely amazing. Of course, you need, they use amplifiers and directional antennas. Some people even do moon bounce, bouncing a signal on the moon. Now that requires, amazing antennas, and it's not for prepping. I mean, it's not the kind of installation that you're going to set up, for a prepper. That's for sure. But it's an excellent band, and I will say it again: get a 2-meter SSB radio, like the MFJ 9402. Or you can go to eBay and find cheap 2-meter SSB radios that are excellent. I got an ICOM IC251, and it's an awesome radio. And that's really, I'm going to try to push that, and because 2-meter SSB is an excellent band for local and near regional. Here I need to talk about MURS, MURS. It's a radio service that is free of, there's no license. It's in the US, and it's 151.82 to 154.6 megahertz. There are just a few channels, I think it's 4 or 5, but it's pretty good for it's pretty good for local communications. The antennas are short, again, like the 2-meter band. There's no license. Of course, no global range. It's for local only. It's low power. If you don't want to get an amateur license, and I don't know why anybody wouldn't, because it's so easy and so cheap. But if you want the same performance as the 2-meter band for local communications, you can use MURS radios. And again, not many people know about them, so there's not a whole lot of traffic there. You might have a little bit of privacy also, more than the FRS radios anyway. And it's a little better than FRS in wooded areas. But, it's low power, it's only for a few miles. But could be useful. And we go up again to the 70 centimeter band. That's UHF, 420 to 450 megahertz. I think in Europe it's, oh wait, it's less. I think it's 430 to 440, something like that. The 70 centimeter band, or UHF in general, is good for urban communications. It's probably better than 2 meters actually for urban comms. It's for local range mostly. Some people again use them with single sideband to cover near regional. So it's possible. Antennas are very, very short and still efficient. So it's especially good for handheld radios. And you can get pretty cheap handhelds for the 70 centimeter band. I really like the TYT MD680 because it's a DMR, digital radio. It's weatherproof, and it has encryption. Of course, it's illegal to use encryption. If it's not well, actually, no, it's illegal, period. But why not have it? You don't have to use it. Stay legal and don't do anything illegal. But it's good to have it. Who knows? So cheap handhelds, very short antennas, great for urban communications. Of course, the con is that it's only mostly for local, and that's all you're going to be using it for. But I have communicated efficiently with the UHF on on very long distances. 20, 30 kilometers, 20 miles, 30 miles. Distances like that. As long as you can find a spot that you're high up somewhere. It's line of sight, so you can go pretty far. That's why I include near regional. That would be, of course, using a single sideband, but Even with a FM handheld, sometimes you can go up to 30 kilometers, 20 miles, and it still works. And of course, if you're connecting to a repeater that has a very, very high antenna, then the limit is quite a bit further. So make sure you get a handheld that has 70 centimeter on it. One of the very popular ones are the Bofeng UV5R and the whole range of radios. They're not very high quality, though. I do prefer TYT, but Bofeng is cheap, and there are other cheap radios like that you can buy. Make sure you program them correctly and you don't transmit where you're not supposed to. Still in the UHF band, we have two particular radio services, and that's FRS for the US and PMR 446 for Europe. So here in France we have PMR 446. It's only 8 channels. Also there is now, I think, a DPMR, something like that, a little bit above the PMR 446, another 8 channels for digital. But it's mostly 8 channels. And those radios are very cheap. We're talking about those bubble wrap Walmart radios that you buy for $30 a pair. And of course, you might want to spend a little bit more, probably $100 a pair, to get something really good. Motorola has very good FRS and PMR radios. So no license. It has a decent urban range for their power, which is only 500 milliwatts. So you're not going to go very far. When you see those radios advertised for 10, 20, sometimes 30 miles, when I see that, I just laugh, because it's ridiculous. Sure, if you were on the International Space Station, it might work, because there is no obstacles to slow down your signal. But on Earth, forget it. It's only 1, 2. Maybe 3 miles. Some people, sometimes are able to do about 10 miles, though, But that's, of course, with a lot of height and, peculiar and rare conditions of propagation. But, it can happen. But usually it's no more than 1 or 2 miles. It's just for local communications, not even to be considered for anything else. Only 8 channels, so not a whole lot of bandwidth, and a lot of people have those radios. Just know that there's a good chance that someone will be listening to you if they're close enough. And you can change antennas. So those bubble wrap radios have fixed antennas. You can't unscrew them and put a Yagi or another kind of directional antenna on them, and it's illegal to do so, by the way. Of course, a lot of people take their regular handheld UHF radios and program those frequencies in them. Now that works very well, of course, because you get, you can put different antennas, and you can use directional antennas, and you have more power, a whole lot more power. But again, that's illegal. Of course, I'm not saying you shouldn't program your radios with those frequencies, and I think definitely you should, and you can listen. And if one day there is a large scale global emergency, basically it hits the fan. If you have a life-threatening emergency or anything like that, you can transmit on any frequency with any power anywhere. So you could use those frequencies. So it's good to have them programmed in, just in case. And our last band I will mention, and that's for the US, GMRS, 462 and 467 megahertz. There are different allocations there. It's a little bit, it's still UHF, so it's good for urban communications. The good thing is that there are repeaters on GMRS frequencies. So that could extend your range quite a bit. You shouldn't rely on them for emergencies, because of course they might not stay up. But there is no exam for the license. There is a license, but you can just send in a little bit of money to the FCC, and they'll send you a license. And it's a family-wide license, so your wife, your kids, anybody can use them. You can have a bunch of them, and it's great for local communications. There is a little bit more power than an FRS radio, by the way. You have to be careful when you buy an FRS radio. A lot of them have GMRS frequencies on them, but you're not allowed to transmit with a higher power on these frequencies and a different antenna or anything like that. Actually, you should have a license. So a lot of people buy those radios, GMRS radios, because they are just sold in supermarkets and stuff. They don't know that they're not allowed to use them without a license. So make sure that if you have a radio that has GMRS frequencies on them, that you get a license. It's just a few dollars. It's not much. You don't have to pass an exam, so there's no reason not to do it. Whew, that was a pretty long video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you would like to see more videos on theory and radio basics. Have a good one.